Welcome to Silent Chronicler. Tonight's Calm Chronicle takes us not into the wilderness, but into something even quieter. A bond. So deep, so total, it becomes a world of its own. Imagine being born with someone so close. They feel like a part of you. You grow together. Speak only to each other. Your silence becomes your language. And everyone else just disappears. People around you try to reach in. But the more they speak, the more you turn inward, deeper into your own universe. You start writing stories no one reads, building codes no one can break. And the longer it goes on, the more you both begin to wonder. What happens when two people are so close that only one of them gets to keep living? This is the story of two sisters, June and Jennifer. Twins who shared everything until one made a decision to let go so the other could breathe. If you're staying with me tonight, leave a like and subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from and what time your night begins. Imagine you are born, and the very first thing you see is someone who looks exactly like you. Not just similar. The same. Same hands. Same blink. Same breath. Your twin. You do not remember a world before her. There was no world before her. When you cried, she cried. When you laughed, she echoed. When your heart beat fast in the dark, hers kept pace, as if you shared one rhythm stretched between two bodies. You learned to speak not to the world, but to her. Long before words, before meaning, there were glances, gestures, a language of pauses and shifts. You were mirrors turned inward. When others tried to separate you, it felt like being peeled apart at the spine. So you stopped speaking to them, to everyone, because the only voice that mattered already existed in someone else's mouth. Years passed like water passing under ice, slow, unseen, but always moving. You wrote stories together, long stories, strange ones, filled with characters who were always half of something else. Your notebooks were sacred, private, written in a hand no one else could decipher. You whispered plot lines under blankets in the dark. You spoke with your eyes across rooms. You invented words, gestures, silences that only you two could survive inside. The outside world called it silence. But you knew better. It was devotion. People worried, teachers, doctors. They tried to draw you out, to separate you for your own good. They thought your closeness was a cage. They didn't understand that without her, you couldn't breathe right. You'd tried once. Just a school trip, one day apart. It ended with you both screaming, tearing at your hair, at your own skin, desperate to be stitched back into place. After that, you made a pact. You would never be separated again. Ever. But something started to shift as you grew. You couldn't explain it. Neither of you could. The silence began to harden. It wasn't just between you and the world anymore. It was between each other. Tiny fractures. A look held too long. A sentence not finished. A breath caught at the wrong time. You still moved together, but it was no longer with ease, it was obligation. Weight. Like you were tethered to a mirror that wouldn't let you blink. You started to feel it in the stories. The characters became violent. The endings grew sharp. One twin always died. One always survived. You tried to laugh it off, tried to say it was just fiction. But deep down you both knew it wasn't. Something had to give. You began to dream about walking alone, about hearing your own footsteps, about not hearing her voice in your head. You never said it aloud. She didn't either. But you felt her watching. Always. Then one day she said it. Just once. Her voice barely audible through the closed door. One of us has to go. You didn't answer. You couldn't. The silence that had once kept you safe now pressed against your chest like a hand refusing to let you rise. You wanted to scream. But what could you scream when your voice was never fully yours? The next morning she was different. Softer. Still, but not quiet. Like someone who had made peace with something. You ate breakfast without looking at each other. You knew. She knew. But you didn't speak. The pact had changed. Something had been decided. In the days that followed, she stopped writing, stopped whispering stories, stopped pressing her hand to yours when the dark came too close. She moved slower, slept longer, watched you with something that wasn't sadness. It was closer to surrender. One evening, she reached for your hand and didn't let go all night. Her grip was so light it felt like breath. When you woke the next morning, her bed was cold. She hadn't moved in hours. Her face was calm, as if the silence had finally returned to where it came from. There was no note, no goodbye, only her body still and perfect, in the shape it had always taken beside yours. You knew what it meant. You knew what she had given. She had let go of the tether so you could finally walk alone. And that night, for the first time in your life, you heard your own voice in the room, speaking not to her, but to yourself. You said, "I'm still here." And the silence didn't answer, but it didn't need to. You carried the silence with you. It wasn't just around you anymore. It was inside, not heavy, not sharp, just there, like an old coat you hadn't realized you were still wearing. Everything sounded different now. Footsteps echoed, doors creaked louder. Even the wind seemed to speak in longer sentences. The world hadn't grown louder. You'd just stopped filtering it through someone else. The days passed like mist curling around trees, quiet, cold, shapeless. You moved through them without rush. You ate because your body remembered how. You slept because your breath still counted the hours, but inside something was shifting, not healing, just softening. You opened one of the old notebooks a week later. Her handwriting met your eyes first, slanted, fast, full of heat. Pages of characters only the two of you had ever known. You ran your fingers over the ink. It felt like touching something alive. She'd stopped mid-sentence in one of the stories. A girl in a red coat standing at the edge of a frozen lake. You knew how it ended. You'd written the next scene in your head 100 times, but for the first time you let yourself write it down. Your hand shook. Not from grief, from weight. The weight of words being yours now. Only yours. You wrote until your fingers cramped. And when you finished, you whispered her name. Not into the room, into the page. She didn't answer. But the page didn't feel empty anymore. Weeks turned to months. You spoke more. Out loud, in rooms, in parks, to strangers. Your voice was soft at first, foreign, like a new language unfolding in your mouth. But people listened. Some tilted their heads like they were hearing something fragile. Some smiled gently. Some didn't understand. That was okay. You didn't need them to. You weren't speaking for them. You were speaking because you could. Sometimes at night, you still felt her. Not like a ghost. Not like memory. Like breath. Like someone sleeping beside you, just out of reach. You didn't look. You just lay there, eyes closed, listening. Once, you whispered thank you. The room didn't reply, but the air grew warmer. One day you walked past a mirror and stopped. Really stopped. You didn't see her anymore. You saw yourself. It startled you. Not because she was gone, but because you didn't expect to be whole without her. You were. You kept writing. The stories changed. They were no longer about twins. No longer about survival. They were quiet stories now. About stillness, about soft mornings, about the sound a teacup makes when it's set down carefully on wood. You read them out loud to yourself, and your voice didn't crack. It resonated. The walls held it gently, like a lullaby from a throat that had once forgotten how to sing. And when you closed the notebook and turned off the light, you did not cry. You just said, "Good night." And for once, the silence that answered you didn't feel empty. It felt full, peaceful, yours. The silence became a companion. Not the kind that filled space, but the kind that made space feel deeper. You no longer feared it. You walked beside it. through long corridors where your footsteps no longer tried to sync with anyone else's, down streets where your shadow finally stretched alone without being matched, in shop windows, in reflections, on bus glass. You saw yourself, singular, solitary, and the world didn't collapse. It waited, listened, accepted. The absence that once pressed like a weight on your ribs now wrapped you with softness. It didn't ask anything from you. It just stayed. You spoke to people slowly, sometimes once a day, sometimes less. Words came with thought now, with pacing. They weren't reflexive like they once were with her. There was no whisper waiting to echo. Every sentence was yours to carry, yours to end. At first it felt like walking on ice, careful, brittle, unsure, but you kept walking. Each conversation a small thaw, each word a step toward warmth. And when you were alone, which was often, you wrote. You didn't just write stories anymore, you wrote letters. Letters to no one, letters to her, letters to yourself. You wrote about silence not as a burden, but as a country you had lived in for too long. You described it like weather, cold, familiar, sometimes beautiful. You wrote about the way your fingers used to tangle in hers at night, not to hold on, but to make sure you were still too. You wrote about the mornings you woke up before her and watched her chest rise and fall and felt jealous of her ease. You wrote about the last night, how quiet she had been, how calm, and how even then you hadn't let yourself believe she would really go. You wrote until your hands hurt, until the room filled with papers, all covered in words you once believed you were incapable of saying. Sometimes at night you dreamed you were still too, not in the past, in a version of now that only existed behind your eyelids. You dreamed of walks you hadn't taken, conversations you hadn't had. You dreamed of holding her hand without needing to ask, of hearing her laugh, not the real laugh, but the one you imagined she would have had if things had been different, lighter. You woke from those dreams with a feeling that wasn't pain. It was weightless. It was grief that had finally become memory. People asked about her, eventually. Not often. Carefully. You nodded. You didn't try to make it poetic. You didn't say she had set you free. You didn't say she had saved you. You just said, she was my sister. And in that sentence you held everything. The silence, the fury, the love, the weight of being born into a world already shared, and the unbearable privilege of having been let go. The world began to open, in small ways. A bookstore where you read your writing aloud, voice low, hands trembling. A cafe where the barista learned your name and remembered your usual. A quiet train ride through foggy hills, where you leaned your head against the window, and for once, didn't feel haunted. The world hadn't changed. But you had. You were no longer half. You were whole. You were not healed, but you were living. And the silence was still there. At night. In corners. In certain memories that rose uninvited. But it didn't scare you. You sat with it now. Like an old friend who no longer needed to be explained. You poured tea in 2 cups some nights. Not as ritual. Not out of denial, but out of gratitude. One for her, one for you. You drank them both. You whispered, thank you, before bed. And when the wind passed the window just right, you thought, maybe you heard something. Not a word. Not a reply. Just presence. The kind that doesn't need to speak to be heard. The kind that never truly leaves. The kind that taught you how to be alone and how, finally, to live. And so the days unfolded not with urgency, but with a soft, measured rhythm, like the ticking of a clock in another room, barely audible, but steady enough to carry you forward. You began to move through the world with less hesitation, not because the grief had vanished, but because it had finally laid down beside you and fallen asleep. It no longer grabbed at your ankles. It no longer asked for explanation. It simply rested where it belonged, in the quiet corners of your life, in the pages of notebooks you no longer needed to hide, in the spaces between your breaths. You no longer feared forgetting her. You understood now that forgetting was impossible. She lived in the cadence of your thoughts, in the instinctive tilt of your head, in the way your eyes scanned a room as if still searching for someone walking exactly in step with you. But the difference was, you no longer waited to find her. You simply continued. There were small joys now. A window open at night that let in the sound of distant rain. A warm scarf around your throat, pulled tight not because of cold, but comfort. The hush of a library. The bloom of early morning fog over a quiet lake. You found yourself standing still more often, not because of dread, but awe. How quiet the world could be when you stopped filling it with echoes. How deep it could feel when you finally allowed yourself to fall into it. You remembered how to be alone, and it didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like being full of your own presence. Your writing changed. The stories were no longer shadowed by unspoken tension. There were still twins in them, sometimes. Still mirrors. But they were no longer trapped, no longer bound by need or pact. They wandered, sometimes apart, sometimes toward different skies. You let your characters breathe. You gave them rooms with windows, long stretches of silence that healed instead of haunted. You no longer feared writing endings. You let the pages close when they wanted to. And the readers who found them? They didn't know your story, but they felt something in the spaces. A softness. A presence. A truth that didn't need names. At night, the dreams returned, but differently. No longer dark. No longer caught in that in-between place of morning and memory. Now, they were quiet landscapes. A path through a pine forest. A cup of tea left on a windowsill. A pair of shoes placed side by side at the edge of a river. Sometimes she was there, not speaking, just present. And you would sit beside her in the dream and neither of you would say anything. But you would wake with a sense that you'd said everything that needed saying. You stopped apologizing for surviving. That was a long road. You walked it one word at a time, one morning at a time. There were moments where the guilt curled back up from the ground, wrapped around your throat and whispered, "Why you?" But you learned to answer. Not with shame, with clarity. Because she had let you go. Because she had given you the sky. And you could not dishonor that by keeping your eyes on the dirt. You looked up more often now. At birds. At stars. At the changing shape of clouds. Every time you did, you whispered thank you. Not to her. Not to the world. Just into the sky. And it was enough. The house grew quieter. Not emptier. Just more your own. You took down some of the photographs, left others. You kept the one of you both laughing. Rare. Real. You framed it without glass, so the paper could breathe. On soft mornings, you placed your fingers to its edge and smiled. There was no ache behind it anymore. Only the memory of sound, of her voice caught mid-laughter. You hadn't forgotten the silence. But it no longer ruled the room. It now lived where it belonged. In the backdrop, the bass note beneath your life's new melody. And sometimes, walking along quiet streets at dusk, you still feel her beside you. Not as a shadow, not as a ghost, but as rhythm, as pause, as the soft weight of everything you've ever loved and lost learning how to live again inside your own footsteps. You walk on, you breathe, you speak, and she is still with you. But now, you are also with yourself, fully and finally. The season shifted without announcement. You noticed it not in calendars or headlines, but in smaller ways. The quality of light on your desk in the late afternoon. The way your coat began to feel less like armor and more like habit. The leaves changed one day without asking for permission. Burnt orange, deep gold, then gone altogether. You didn't dread the early dark anymore. The shadows felt familiar, no longer filled with waiting. You learned to sit with them, to light a candle not to fight them back, but to welcome their quiet company. You wrote in their presence, you spoke into them. You did not need to be heard. Your world became wider, but not louder. You walked further, through parks where branches arched like cathedral ceilings, past windows where the hum of dinners and soft music brushed against the glass. People passed you and you smiled back. Not because you had to, but because the moment asked for nothing more. You did not tell your story, not to them, not yet. It stayed in your chest like a stone that had long since stopped sinking. Not heavy, just grounded. At home, your shelves filled slowly. Books you never finished. Journals half written. A single red coat you never wore hung by the door. Not for memory, not for ritual, just because it belonged. The room where you once couldn't sleep now held peace. You didn't need noise to fill the space. Some nights, the silence itself felt like a kind of companionship. A steady breath across the floorboards. A pulse in the still air. You began to understand something you hadn't before. Not all presence needs a body. Some things stay because we make room for them. You began to cook again. Simple meals. Sliced fruit on soft plates. A spoon stirring something warm in a pot that filled the air with comfort. The smell of cinnamon. The crackle of toast. You ate slowly. No longer with distraction. You set the table for one. But sometimes, without thinking, you'd pour a second glass of water. And you never poured it out. Your voice grew stronger, steadier. You didn't raise it often, but when you did, it carried. You read aloud in bookstores, your words finding others who sat quietly, listening. Some asked questions, some said nothing, but all of them heard you. And in their eyes, you saw something gentle, something you hadn't expected to find again, understanding. You visited the lake in spring, alone, not to mourn, but to walk. The surface was still. The trees along the bank hung heavy with new leaves. A breeze passed, lifting your hair, and for a moment you closed your eyes. Not in memory, but in presence. You felt everything. The ground beneath your feet, the air against your skin, the sound of water folding over itself, again and again, as if the earth had learned how to breathe in sleep. You whispered her name, not out of pain, but gratitude. It drifted out across the water, and that was enough. There were no goodbyes. Not anymore. Only quiet departures. Only long pauses. Only the gentle closing of doors that didn't need to slam. You stopped asking for signs. You no longer needed her to show up in dreams or birdsong or coincidences. She had already given you the only thing you ever needed, the space to live. You continued. Not in her place. Not for her. But with her. Carried not like weight, but like light. And each night, before the candle burned down and the world grew blue with sleep, you placed your hand to your chest and listened. Not for a voice, not for a reply, just for the silence. And when it came, full and steady, you finally understood. It was never emptiness. It was you. You. That one word, once tangled in the rhythm of someone else's breath, now stood whole, solitary, and certain. It didn't echo anymore. It didn't look over its shoulder, waiting for another voice to follow. It stood in place like a stone warmed by sun, not heavy, not cold. Just there. True yours. You began to write that word more often. In the margins of books, in the first lines of stories. On blank pages not out of declaration, but as grounding. A reminder. A soft return to the self. Your life no longer revolved around memory. It flowed with it, like a current around a smooth stone in a quiet stream. It was still there, always there, but no longer a force that dictated direction. You moved where you wanted now, woke when you pleased, dressed in colors you once thought were too loud, too bright, laughed when it rose, cried only when you needed to. You didn't explain it to anyone. The world never asked, and that was a mercy. You met people, carefully, quietly. You shared tea with them, walked with them, read them lines you hadn't read aloud before, And when they asked about your past, about the ache beneath your voice, you didn't flinch. You told them. Not all at once, not in full, but gently. Like letting them into a room where someone once slept. You spoke of her. Not as shadow, not as tragedy, but as breath. As the first sound you ever heard. As the only silence you ever trusted. You spoke her name. And when you did, you smiled. You visited her once, in a way. Not with flowers, not with ceremony, but with presence. You stood in the place she'd left the world, and you said nothing. You didn't need to. The air was thick with stillness, with knowing. The trees around you didn't sway, the ground didn't shift. Everything was held. In that moment, so were you. There were no words. Only one breath, deep, slow, final. And then the turning away. Not out of forgetting, but continuing. You found joy in small repetitions. Folding blankets, opening windows in the morning, laying a book face down beside a candle. The rituals of the everyday became sacred not because they were dramatic, but because they were yours. And with each one, you wrote a new rhythm into the day, a new silence, not absence, not longing, but fullness. The kind of fullness that once only belonged to being two, but now belonged to simply being. Sometimes walking home in the early evening light, you felt her step behind yours. Not an echo, in alignment. Not as weight, as shadow. Not haunting, holding. And you never turned around. You didn't need to see her. She was not behind you. She was beneath, within, around. Her breath had become wind. Her voice had become the hush between pages turning. Her presence was no longer separate from yours. She had not left you. She had let you be. And that is not the same. That is everything. There were mornings when you forgot how long it had been since she was gone. Not because the pain had vanished, but because it had finally woven itself into the fabric of ordinary time. The kind of time marked not by clocks, but by light slanting through the window, by the sound of a kettle just before it boils. By the moment your breath rises in the still air and does not meet an echo. These mornings felt softer. They held you without question, without demand. You no longer braced for the memory. It arrived quietly, as a presence, not an interruption. You could carry it without it breaking you. That was new. That was everything. You moved through your days with a rhythm that was not forced. You no longer performed solitude like a ritual. You simply lived it. You walked slowly through markets, letting your fingers graze the edges of oranges, the ridges of imperfect fruit. You lingered by windows in cafes and let the light settle on your skin. You sat on benches and watched leaves fall without making metaphors out of them. Things were no longer symbols, they were just things, beautiful in their being, unadorned, untranslated. Writing returned in full waves. Not the frantic scribbling of grief, but the slow crafting of clarity. Paragraphs stretched like quiet roads. Characters breathed deeper. Dialogue softened. You didn't need to make things loud anymore. The world you built with your pen now whispered. And people leaned in. Readers wrote to you, gently. They said your stories made them feel seen, held, soothed. They didn't know what you had survived. They didn't need to. It was in the space between your sentences, in the pauses, in the breath that came before the page turned. You kept the house uncluttered, not bare, intentional. Only objects that hummed with memory. A mug with a hairline cracked down one side, a scarf folded over the back of a chair, never worn but never moved. The coat, still by the door, untouched but never dusty. You dusted around it with care. You didn't treat it like a relic. You treated it like something still listening. Sometimes you stood near it and said nothing at all, and the silence around it felt thicker, warmer, like the moment just before rain. When winter came, it brought a hush that you welcomed. The early dark didn't scare you anymore. It made the inside spaces glow more. You lit candles not to hold the night away, but to welcome it inward. You brewed tea and read slowly, books with old spines and yellowed pages. And in the deep night, when the wind coiled around the house and nothing stirred, you felt something like prayer. Though you did not pray. You just listened. You said thank you. You said her name. You didn't wait for an answer. You began walking the same route each morning, past the small bookstore, through the iron gate into the park, along the outer path that bordered the woods. It became a ritual, not one of remembrance but of becoming. You listened to the sound of your steps, to the crunch of gravel, the hush of wind, the caw of distant birds. Your breath timed itself to the rhythm. Your heart no longer raced with fear. It beat with calm. Sometimes you sat on the bench near the frozen pond where the world looked paused in glass. You watched it, not for movement, but for presence. There were no signs, no sudden gusts, no animal crossing your path, just stillness. That was the sign. The stillness itself, the same kind of stillness you once feared, now wrapped around you like a second skin. You were no longer trying to explain anything, not to others, not to yourself. You no longer sought the right metaphor. You let things exist without naming them. The past was no longer a hallway you walked every night. It had become a window, one you could open when you chose, one you could close without guilt. You hadn't forgotten. You had finally remembered without pain. In the quiet, you began humming again, softly, at the sink, while folding clothes, while waiting for water to boil. Your voice surprised you sometimes, not its sound, but its ease. There was no audience, no echo. Just the pleasure of the note, the movement of sound through a space that once knew only silence. And if, on some nights, you reached out to the empty space beside you in bed, it wasn't out of sorrow. It was out of habit, out of memory, out of love. You let your hand rest there, open. And even if no hand met yours, the gesture still mattered. It was a reminder. You had loved. You had been known. And now, you were alive. Not haunted. Not half. Whole. Quiet. Steady. And when the candle finally flickered low, when your breath grew slow and heavy, when the house around you fell into the deep sleep of midnight, and the last word of the day echoed once in your mind before fading, you smiled. Because even if no one saw you, even if the silence never spoke back, you had learned how to live inside it. And that was enough. Some nights, the quiet wrapped around you so fully it felt like water. Not drowning, suspending. You floated inside it, eyes open in the dark, aware of every sound the world wasn't making. The fridge settling, a floorboard shifting with the memory of footsteps. Your own heartbeat, steady now, no longer trying to match a second rhythm. You had stopped searching for her in those sounds. Not because you stopped missing her, but because you had begun to understand. She wasn't in the echo. She was in the stillness that remained once the echo had faded. Your body changed, too. You stood differently now, shoulders no longer curled inward to shield you from eyes you feared. You walked taller, not in defiance, not in pride, but in quiet permission. You gave it to yourself. Each morning your reflection was less of a surprise. Not because you looked the same, but because you finally recognized the person standing there. The singularity of your presence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. There were new dreams now. Long, wide places. Vast fields with no voices. Sometimes just wind over grass. Sometimes a shoreline with no tide. You woke from these dreams with the impression of peace rather than a story. You stopped trying to interpret them. Not everything was a message. Some things were just a softness offered by the brain, like a blanket laid over a long day. You accepted them without needing them to mean more. Letters came from readers, from strangers, people who had read your books and found pieces of themselves inside your quiet. They spoke of sisters, of silence, of grief that wouldn't let go until it was held. You answered them, slowly, gently, not as an expert, just as someone who knew how to listen. Sometimes you wrote long replies. Sometimes just a sentence. You are not alone. You did not need to say more. They understood, the way you had once needed someone to understand you. Spring returned again, earlier than usual. Buds showed on branches before the last frost had finished. You opened your windows each morning, letting in air still cold, but brave enough to carry birdsong. The birds had never stopped singing. You had just learned to hear them again. And the light, though pale, had a new patience to it. It stretched slowly across the floor, lingered on the pages of your books, warmed your hands without asking them to write. You didn't rush to do anything with it. You just sat in it. And that too was something new. There were no milestones to mark the healing, no grand awakenings, no moment where the grief suddenly vanished like a storm lifting. It wasn't like that. It was more like moss growing back after winter, like breath returning after you'd forgotten you were holding it. A slow re-entry into the self. A return so gradual you didn't notice it until one day. In the mirror, you smiled and didn't feel it crack. You visited places she would have loved. Not with longing, with offering. You carried her name in your chest, not on your lips. Let it warm the inside of you like a lantern tucked behind the ribs. You took her to the library, to a quiet harbor at sunset, to a museum filled with paintings that said what words never could. And in every place, you didn't ask her to appear. You just said, inside your heart, you're welcome to stay. Sometimes, you spoke aloud in the house. Not to her. Not to the past. Just to yourself. I'm doing okay. The walls heard you. The floor, the window panes, the empty hallway where two sets of footsteps once echoed. And nothing needed to answer. The silence had stopped being something to conquer. It was now your companion. Your witness. The shape of your new life. Not lesser. Just quieter. And in that quiet, something had finally bloomed. Not loudly, not all at once, but completely. You were not waiting anymore. You were home. By summer, the stillness had become second nature, woven into the folds of every day, not as absence, but as a kind of quiet presence that followed you like a soft shadow. You no longer strained to remember what it felt like to be two. The memory hadn't faded. It had simply settled, like dust on an old book left open to a page you no longer needed to reread. The story was still there, but you had stopped living inside it. You had stepped past the sentence where everything broke and found there were still pages left, more than you expected. Blank ones, waiting. You began to travel again, slowly and not far at first. A short train ride to a town by the coast. A small room in a quiet inn, with thin curtains and the scent of salt in the air. You sat by the window in the evenings, watching the sea fold over itself without rush, without violence. You walked the shoreline in bare feet, sand cold even in the sun. You carried a notebook in your pocket, but didn't write in it. Not yet. Just having it was enough. Proof of openness, possibility. You met people. Not in crowds, not by force, just naturally, through quiet intersections. A shared bench in a museum, a borrowed lighter outside a cafe. You learned how to listen without disappearing, how to speak without apology. You told the truth in small portions. I used to be part of a pair. I write about silence. I've learned how to be alone. And sometimes when someone looked at you for a second too long, the way people do when they recognize something familiar in a stranger, you would offer the softest piece of the story. She's gone. And that would be enough. Their nods, their silence, their stillness in response told you. You had been heard. You changed the furniture in your home, not because you needed to, but because you were ready. The chair that had sat untouched in the corner, the one that always felt like it was waiting for her, you finally moved it into the light. You sat in it yourself, drank tea there, read poems aloud to the air. At night, you stopped turning down the blanket on the other side of the bed. It stayed made. And somehow that didn't feel cold. It felt respectful. You wrote again. Not from pain, but from stillness. Pages and pages of slow, careful prose. You no longer needed to excavate emotion like a wound. You wrote about ordinary things. A woman watching birds from a kitchen sink. A child learning to count the stars. A man who carries a letter in his coat for years before reading it. And when readers found your words, they said your writing felt like breathing. That it didn't ask for anything. That it simply stayed beside them, the way a quiet friend might. You smiled when you read those letters. That's all you'd ever wanted. To make something that could hold another person, without pressing, without breaking. The house at night was peaceful. There were no ghosts, just memory, folded into the fabric of things. The books on the shelf, the echo of a laugh in the corner of the kitchen. A coat still hanging by the door, but there was no ache, just warmth. The kind of warmth that lingers after a candle's gone out, when the air still remembers the flame. And sometimes, just before bed, you would speak her name aloud, not to summon, not to grieve, just to place it in the room. A small offering, a soft tether, and the room would hold it gently. Not as something gone, but as something transformed. She was not lost. You were not broken. You had both changed shape. And in the silence that followed, deep and wide and entirely your own, you breathed, steady, whole, alive. You no longer counted the days. Grief had stopped marking time, and joy never asked to. Life no longer needed to be measured by contrast, by before and after together and alone. It simply was, unfolding slowly like steam rising from a warm cup on a windowsill. You took comfort in routine, not out of fear of change, but because routine now felt like poetry, repetition with variation. The kettle's whistle, the way your slippers softened the creak of the floor, the pull of ink across the page, these things grounded you, not because they filled a void, but because they reminded you how full the quiet could be when it was no longer synonymous with loss. Some days you remembered her suddenly, not dramatically, not like a wave crashing through your chest. Just a moment. A certain slant of light. A phrase spoken by a stranger. The soft thud of a book closing. You would turn slightly, as if to share it, out of habit. And then smile. Not at the absence. At the presence of the moment itself. You were no longer mourning her silence. You were living inside the echo she had left for you to carry. You found yourself laughing more. Not always loudly, but deeply. The kind of laughter that rolls up from the body unexpectedly like a breeze across water. It didn't mean forgetting. It meant freedom. You allowed it. You invited it. You let joy return without guilt, like a bird landing on your shoulder of its own will. And in those moments when joy met memory without conflict, you felt something you had never expected again, peace without apology. The room you once shared became something else, a study, a reading room. You kept some of her things there, not out of resistance, but respect. A book with her handwriting in the margins. A scarf she once forgot on the back of a chair. A paperweight shaped like a sleeping cat. Nothing arranged like a shrine, just lived with. Accepted. Her presence had moved out of the walls and into your rhythm. She was in the way you brewed tea, in the way you paused before speaking, in the patience you showed yourself when no one was watching. When you dreamed of her now, it wasn't a visitation. It was a walk. Sometimes through a quiet town, sometimes along a beach where the waves whispered like pages turning. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. You would walk side by side, and when you woke, the dream wouldn't hurt. It would stay with you like music heard through a closed door. Faint, familiar, just enough. Your writing deepened, became stiller. You didn't write to explain anymore, or to prove that you had survived. You wrote because you were living, and living had become a story worth telling. The silences between paragraphs were longer now, intentional. You trusted your readers to linger. You didn't rush to fill every space. You had learned some truths are best felt in what goes unspoken. And when readers came to hear you speak, you stood with ease. You did not look for her in the crowd. You looked out and met eyes. Some were tearful, some smiling, all quiet, all listening. And you told them what you knew to be true. Not the story of a twin who had left, but of a voice that had once needed permission to exist. Of a woman who had walked into silence and stayed until it opened. Of a life that was not halved by grief, but multiplied by the echo it left behind. That night, when the applause had faded and the city had softened around you, you returned home. You took off your shoes, lit one small candle, sat by the window. The trees were swaying, slow and deliberate, their branches casting gentle shadows against the walls. You placed your hand to your chest and listened, not for a heartbeat beside yours, but for the space within it. There was no reply. There didn't need to be, because you had become your own silence, and it no longer asked you to stay small. It simply asked you to stay. Autumn returned like a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. Cool, golden, unhurried. Leaves curled inward before letting go, drifting in spirals that mirrored the quiet rhythm of your days. You watched them fall from your window, not as metaphor, but as movement. As proof that endings didn't have to be sudden, that letting go could be gentle. You no longer chased the meaning of things. You let them arrive, let them sit beside you, let them pass. There was a stillness now that belonged entirely to you, not borrowed, not shared, not held together by the fragile threads of a bond stretched too far. This stillness didn't echo, it didn't demand, it simply lived in the pauses you allowed yourself to take, in the way you opened books without needing to finish them, in the way you walked without needing a destination. The silence wasn't something you lived inside anymore. It was something you carried, like a familiar weight, balanced, known. You visited old places sometimes, not to remember but to witness how they had changed. A bench where you once sat with her, now shaded by older trees. A corner in the library where her voice once lingered in a whisper. These places did not ache anymore. They greeted you like old friends who no longer needed to ask what happened. They knew. You stayed for a moment, sometimes longer, then moved on. Your home had softened. Blankets draped in places once left bare. Light filtered through sheer curtains that danced with the breeze. You kept fresh flowers on the table, not always arranged, sometimes just set loosely in a jar, as if to say, even beauty doesn't have to try so hard. The scent of lavender and paper hung in the air. When guests visited, they remarked on the quiet, not as emptiness but as peace. You nodded, made tea, and let the silence hold them too. You no longer flinched when asked about her. You told the truth without armor, that you loved her, that it was complicated, that you forgave her, that she stayed with you, not in the mirror, not in your shadow, but in the way you know how to be still without fear. In the way you now let the world unfold without trying to control it. She was my beginning, you once said in an interview, and now she's the breath between my sentences. The audience went quiet, not out of discomfort, but respect. Some nights you lit a single candle and read aloud, to the room, to the quiet, to yourself. Her name didn't need to be spoken. It was there in the room's hush, in the softness of your voice, in the way the flame moved slightly with every word you released into the air. There was no longer grief in these moments, only tenderness, only return. The mirror in the hallway still reflected both of you sometimes. Not in form, but in feeling. A posture, a glance, a shared memory behind your eyes. You smiled when it happened, touched the frame once, lightly, and walked on. You didn't stay. You didn't turn back. Not out of pain, out of reverence for the path you had walked, to be here, alone and whole, and on the first winter night of the year. As the wind curled around the windows and the silence settled deeper into the floorboards, you sat in your favorite chair, wrapped yourself in the same blanket, held a book you'd written, its spine soft from use. You closed your eyes, and the silence greeted you, not like a twin, not like a ghost, but like a homecoming. And you said, to no one, and to everything, I'm still here. And the stillness held you in its arms like it always had. But now it held only you. There was no ceremony, no moment where you declared it complete. Healing, after all, never announces itself. It moves like water soaking into dry earth, quiet, slow, impossible to witness until one day the ground is no longer cracking. You lived with that kind of healing now, not loud, not sharp, just a gentle widening of space inside your days. Space for light, for stillness, for breath that did not catch on memory but flowed over it like wind over old stones. You began to notice things more, not because you were searching, but because you had stopped running. The tilt of the moon through your window, the exact weight of a mug in your hand, the soft scrape of your pen against the last page of a notebook. You moved slower, not from weariness, but from presence. You allowed the moment to be what it was, without needing to wrap it in meaning. You understood now that most of life doesn't ask to be solved. It asks to be felt. And you had learned how to feel everything without drowning. The house had settled around you like a second skin. The rooms knew your patterns now. The floor knew where your feet fell. The silence between walls had shaped itself around your voice, the way silence sometimes does when it stops trying to smother and starts learning how to listen. You kept the lights low in the evenings, not out of sadness, but comfort. You liked how shadows moved softly across the walls. You liked how your breath sounded in the hush. Your stories became slower, deeper, less about what happened, more about what lingered, what stayed, what moved quietly through people without ever needing to explain itself. You wrote about grief the way one writes about wind, through what it touches, not what it is. Readers said your words felt like a room they could walk into and sit down in without needing to speak. That was all you ever wanted. Not to be understood, but to give others a place to rest. One afternoon you found yourself laughing, fully, uncontrollably, at something small and absurd. No one else was there. No one else needed to be. And after the laughter passed, you sat still for a long time, hand over your chest, feeling the echo of joy settle in the bones where sorrow used to sit. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like arrival. Like the part of you that had been waiting at the door for years had finally come inside. You returned to places you'd once avoided. Not to reclaim them. Just to be there, as you are now. The bookstore where you'd once stood too still. The pier, where you used to listen for double footsteps. You walked through them like walking through a dream made real. And nothing pulled. Nothing pressed. The world had changed its grip on you. Or maybe you had changed your grip on it. You no longer held it out of fear of forgetting. You held it out of love for what it had taught you to remember. Sometimes you spoke to her still, in your head, in a room where the light pooled just right. Not with longing, with ease. You would have loved this, you'd say, placing your hand to a book's open page, or, I'm okay, or nothing at all, just a breath, a glance toward the empty chair where silence no longer hurt. On the last day of the year, snow fell, soft, full, soundless. You watched it from your window, the sky thick with quiet. There was no rush to mark the time, no countdown, just you. The room, the hush, you stood there for a long while unmoving, letting the white blanket the world, letting the cold press lightly against the glass. You placed your palm to it. I remember, you said. And that was all. And that was enough. Winter held the world in stillness, the kind of stillness not born from absence but from rest. Everything seemed to move slower, as if even time had chosen to soften its pace. The days unfolded like pale pages, quiet and unhurried. You spent them wrapped in layers, wool, tea steam, candlelight, and moved through them as one moves through deep snow, deliberately, peacefully, leaving gentle footprints you no longer needed to follow back. The silence was no longer something that circled you. It was something you had folded into. It had contours now, depth, a familiar scent like pine or old paper. You woke into it each morning with ease. You made your bed not as ritual but as kindness. You read by the window, not to escape the world, but to meet it in a different shape. You allowed yourself long afternoons of thought, not to solve, not to fix, just to sit beside whatever surfaced. And sometimes, when the sky turned that particular shade of gray that only winter knows, you thought of her. But not as the missing piece. She wasn't missing anymore. She was simply elsewhere in the structure, like a beam hidden behind the wall, like the root of a tree you no longer see but still feel underfoot. Her presence had become invisible, not gone, woven into the smallest things, the way you folded towels, the way you watched for the moon, the way you smiled at silence. You no longer feared being alone, not because you had filled the space, but because you had stopped calling it empty. There were no more echoes, only reverberations, like the last note of a song that hums in the chest long after the room falls quiet. Her voice, once bound to yours, had settled into the memory of its echo, and yours, once hesitant, once split, now stood steady on its own. There were new dreams in your nights, dreams without dialogue, just places, light through trees, water that never ends. Sometimes you stood beside someone in them, not always her, just someone. You never spoke, but you woke feeling held, as if some part of the world had responded to you, not in words, but in presence. That was all you needed now. Not answers, not signs, just the slow recognition that the world continued to meet you where you were. Your writing changed again. It grew even quieter, more like breathing than storytelling. You no longer wrote to explain silence, you wrote from within it. You let white space speak. You let endings come without punctuation. Readers wrote to you saying your work felt like closing your eyes in a warm room. You never responded with advice, only with thanks. Because you had nothing to teach, only something to share. On your birthday, you did not mark the day with sadness. You baked a small cake, lit a candle, sang softly. Not for her, not even for yourself, just to fill the air with kindness. You cut one slice, ate slowly, no rush, no wait. And when the sun slipped behind the trees and the shadows stretched across the floor, you felt something shift. Not in the room, in you. You were not waiting anymore, not for peace, not for understanding, not for a voice in the dark. You had arrived, and even though you could not say when or how or what exact path brought you here, you knew the shape of it now. This life, this stillness, this breath you lived inside each day. It was yours, utterly, and always would be. One evening, as late winter gave way to the slow breath of spring, you opened the window just wide enough to let the air in. Not cold anymore, just sharp enough to feel real. Outside, the world had begun to shift. Not loudly. There were no blossoms yet, no green explosions. Just the subtle lean of branches, the soft unraveling of ice, the murmur of things not blooming but preparing to. You leaned into that kind of patience. You understood it now. Not everything has to hurry toward beauty. Sometimes the waiting is the most sacred part. You sat at your desk, pen in hand, candle lit beside a cooling mug. You didn't write at first. You just listened. The world had a different voice in this season, somewhere between sleep and waking. You imagined it like a held breath beneath snow, 1,000 roots stretching under frozen ground, whispering, "Not yet, not yet, but soon." You closed your eyes and whispered back, "I know." That was all. You had stopped measuring your life by what had been taken. You no longer marked days by grief or milestones by absence. You lived them, fully, quietly, completely. There were mornings when you danced, alone in socks, to music no one else could hear. There were nights when you read until your eyes ached, not to escape, but to stay inside the softness of a world that asked nothing of you but to listen. You went to the farmer's market, bought flowers without a reason. You cooked for yourself with care. The way she used to fold napkins. The way she would tilt her head when tasting soup. You carried those small gestures like heirlooms, not relics. They lived through your hands. Through habit, through grace. You no longer looked for signs. Not because you didn't believe in them, but because you didn't need them. Her presence was in the architecture of your peace, not in the flicker of lights or the flutter of curtains. In the fact that you no longer needed to be followed to feel loved. You were safe in solitude, not hidden from the world, held by it. When strangers asked about your life, you told them parts, the soft parts, the ordinary ones, the shape of your days, the things you noticed now, how the birds outside your window sometimes sang to each other just before dawn, how you started to hum again when you cleaned. You didn't always mention her. You didn't always mention the silence. But it was there, in the way your voice never rushed, in the way you let pauses linger, in the kindness behind your eyes. On the first warm day of spring, you went walking early, before the streets stirred. The city was hushed, sky still a pale blue-gray. You walked past trees whose buds had just begun to swell, past windows where lights flickered on slowly. You carried nothing, not even a notebook. You didn't need to collect the moment. You were already inside it. And when you stopped at a bench, the same one where, once upon a life, you had sat with her in silence, you didn't cry. You simply sat. And when the wind passed brushing over your shoulder, you smiled. Not because it felt like her, but because it felt like something living. And that was enough. You no longer lived in the story of what was lost. You lived in the story of what remained, and it was beautiful. The days stretched longer now, just slightly. Sun lingering at the edge of evening, tracing golden fingers across your walls like an old friend returning without knocking. You moved with the light, slow and deliberate. There was no urgency anymore, no need to fill the space between waking and sleep. You had made peace with the quiet, and it had made peace with you. Even the ticking of the clock felt gentler now, not a reminder of time passing, but a rhythm to breathe beside. You began tending to small things. Repotting a plant you'd nearly given up on. Sewing a loose button back onto a sweater. Wiping the dust from the top of a bookshelf, not because it bothered you, but because you wanted to care for what you touched. There was reverence in your hands now, not perfection, just presence. You were no longer trying to fix, only to honor. Her name came up sometimes. Not in conversation, but in thought. Walking down an unfamiliar street and seeing a child with her exact laugh. Hearing a song on a radio that made your chest catch. Not with pain, just with memory. These moments didn't sting. They wrapped around you, soft and bittersweet. She was no longer a shadow in the corner. She was a thread in the fabric. Woven in, never pulled. You didn't need to say her name aloud to feel it pressed gently behind your teeth. In the evenings, you sometimes wrote without aim. Pages and pages that never became stories. Just thoughts. Observations. The way dust curled itself across the kitchen floor. How your breath fogged the glass when you leaned close. The memory of her hand beside yours, not clasping, just close enough to feel the warmth. These words weren't meant to be read. They were offerings to the silence. And the silence received them. One night after a day of gentle rain, you walked to the park. The pavement glistened. Puddles shimmered beneath street lamps. The trees dripped slowly, each leaf giving its own quiet sigh. You stood beneath one and let the drops fall into your hair, your face. You closed your eyes and remembered nothing specific, just the weight of being held. By time, by weather, by the kind of peace that comes not after everything is understood, but after you stop needing it to be. Back home, you dried off, changed, lit a candle. You sat by the window and watched the water bead on the glass. You wrapped a blanket around your shoulders and leaned back. The room smelled of lavender and rain. You said nothing. Not to her. Not to the past. Not to the night. And the night said nothing back. But it stayed. In that moment, you realized something so small and so complete it barely needed a name. You were no longer trying to become. You already were. And in the stillness, In the hush between breaths, the world exhaled with you, as if to say, yes, this is enough. Spring gave way to summer without fanfare. One morning, the light changed just enough. The breeze smelled not of memory but of open windows and warm earth. You stood at the threshold, barefoot on the wooden floor, watching leaves stir outside, not with purpose, just motion. The kind that didn't need to lead anywhere. The kind that reminded you how long it had taken to arrive at this stillness. You poured a glass of water, sat down at your table, let the morning unfold. The house didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt complete. The walls held you. The air held you. You no longer needed noise to prove you were living. You were the evidence. You were here. And that was everything. The chair across from you was empty, as it had been for years. And yet it no longer felt unfilled. You looked at it, sometimes, and smiled. Not out of sadness, not even longing. Just in recognition. That someone had once shared this silence with you. That she had trusted you enough to leave. And you had kept going. You spent that day not marking anything. Not an anniversary. Not a memory. Just living it. Reading slowly. Steeping tea. Watching shadows shift on the wall. You didn't speak her name. You didn't light a candle. You didn't need to. You were not keeping her alive anymore. She was. In you. Around you. In the stillness you no longer resisted. As night fell, you opened the window again, let the evening move through the room. You sat quietly, not waiting, just being. And you whispered one final thing, not out loud, not even in thought, just a feeling. Like breath let go into the dark. A life had passed through you. A silence had reshaped you. And what remained was not absence. It was depth. You were no longer searching. You were no longer remembering. You were simply here, whole, unfinished, free, good night.